speaker, Mal Hyman. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the warm welcome. Appreciate the opportunity.
Now, we're recording, so you're going to have to hold it close.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's great to be with you.
Much closer.
Much
Good.
closer.
Yeah, I'm still learning on this. In fact, work in progress. To give you a little sense of me, I grew up Jewish in Los Angeles. When I turned 13, some Jewish guys are bar mitzvah. I was not. Family wasn't all that religious. But it was the same day Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. I thought, my God, I'm listening to a prophet. I'm going to read the New Testament more closely. I came of age in the 60s.
There you go. Act like it's an ice cream cone.
And 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, I was a senior in high school. I could see the air I was breathing. The country had gone through almost 100 riots. War in Vietnam had divided the country. Friends on my basketball team, some had brothers that were in gangs, and others had parents that had been through the Holocaust. And I was trying to make sense of the world the best I could. So when I started at UCLA, I guess I was moving from a love of sports to really wanting to sort out my place in society. And I remember walking onto campus, and there would be 30 different organizations that had tables, including Kurdish rights at the time. I didn't even know where the Kurds lived. If you wanted an education, you could talk to all of those people. I did. I took my classes seriously. I remember demonstrations on campus where the police broke them up. I remember my first arrest on campus where a cop was beating a friend, and I grabbed the cop from behind, and they arrested me for interfering with an arresting officer. I couldn't stand by and watch it. It's only later I found out what happened to Jimmy Lee Jackson and what happened when he did it. So a lot of this came to me just because I felt that I wanted to make sense of the world when I was younger and didn't quite know how to do it. As I finished UCLA, I worked full-time for George McGovern in San Jose, and then ran a couple conferences on environmental rights, and took the rest of my money and went to the Middle East, lived on a kibbutz, and in rambling through Jerusalem, I'd heard enough stories and talked to enough Palestinians that I thought maybe I should devote my life to teaching and maybe we can sort this out. And years later, you realize you're always practicing teaching like you're practicing medicine and practicing law. You're always trying to get a little bit better. And I realized that I had to do something outside of the classroom. A little bit on my journey. When I taught in public schools, I was stunned by what I had seen. I had 6 classes of 40 in a class, 7th graders when I started. I was going to save the world, and after a year I was wondering what was going on with things. I'd only later realized that it was not a very good system, and the system had to completely change. I became a commercial fisherman for a little bit. They tempted me back to teaching by saying that you could set up a program in a medium security men's prison, Chino prison, and they would lay off and see what I could do. I did that for 5 years. I essentially burned out from doing it. I was not well trained for it, but they play basketball with the inmates and lift weights with them, and I was able to figure out how to do the GED. They passed it, and I could bring in guest lecturers. Learned a lot from talking to the inmates. I learned they fell into despair and hopelessness at the age of 11, 12, and 13. And they didn't pick their parents, they didn't pick their communities, they didn't pick their schools, and they didn't pick their country. And I realized we had to work in a different way to create harmony and opportunity. My last year at the prison, they let me teach maximum security prison part-time, and I went to graduate school. I did community organizing in Riverside, California. I went to every group that was around, said we have to work together, we're not getting anywhere separately. Had about a dozen groups. One of the people I met was part of the Pentagon Papers, Mel teacher at the University of California, Riverside. I'd never met anybody that had a clearance like that knew the stories of the CIA, the State Department, and gave up his job and his clearance to tell the truth. I found him an inspiration, and it got me to graduate school. I met people from around the world. They said the first thing you have to do, you have to go to the war zones. You have to bear witness and see what's going on if you're going to do a good job as a teacher. We're in the midst of the war in Nicaragua, and I went with a church group, Pastors for Peace. They were a terrific group to be with, and I saw an awful lot. They had translators. We met all sorts of people. They told their stories, and I realized, my God, this is way worse than they're telling us on TV, and came back more invigorated as a teacher. Had a chance to teach at Coker College. They essentially said, if you want to do human rights work, go ahead and do it. Each time I did it, I got a little bit stronger, a little bit more bold. We met a fellow who had been to the Middle East, and I thought during the First Intifada that I needed to be there to talk to Palestinians, to see what was going on. And it literally took my breath away to hear the stories. First interview was with a woman whose daughter was 3 years old, and she died of tear gas. And I had to take the report, and we had people sign afterward a legal affidavit. We presented them to Congress, and I realized that I had to be doing more than I had been doing. Very fortunate to have the chance to teach at a small college, and a few years ago started to do a class on Martin Luther King. Typically I do classes on social problems or modernization, revolution, sociology of literacy, do a class with my wife, sociology of food, where I get to talk about questions of poverty, as well as food culture and food safety. If you will bear with me on this, because unlike the Rev, I'm going to have to look at my notes to bring you some of what I had prepared on Martin Luther King. So I hate to retreat, but I do need to look at it. You know, some don't realize that King
We're going to need the mic. Okay.
King was called to the ministry early. His dad and granddad had been ministers. And he skipped a few grades in high school, entered Morehouse College at the age of 15, and moved into the ministry at the age of 18. His PhD at the age of 26. And he moves from being a theologian and a scholar to an activist for a range of reasons. At Morehouse College, he was challenged by the president of the college, Dr. Mays, pushed all of the Morehouse men to be citizens and to take risks. In his first position in the ministry in Montgomery, the bus boycott was started, and they tapped him to be a leader in the process because he was new, and they knew he was smart and clear and an inspiration. And when you listen to some of the speeches, Eyes on the Prize is a terrific series on the civil rights movement. I mean, you hate to damn it by saying it's a classic, but it is that good, and it holds up really well. And you may not have heard the speech where King is trying to rouse people to have them get active so that they actually stand up for their rights. And these are people that are in despair and hopelessness, and he's given them a sense of fight. And he is literally saying, and this is a close paraphrase, if we are wrong, the Bill of Rights is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. And people go absolutely crazy. They stand, they're applauding. They know they're listening to somebody that's feeling it in his heart. He is going to lead them the best that he can. King's teachings early on were guided by Gandhi. Many of you know that. Some of you may not know some of Gandhi's teachings. I thought I'd share just a touch with you today, because Gandhi's daily meditation from the Gita is something that King read He read a number of books about Gandhi, and he is really a mix of Gandhi's Satyagraha with a notion of the Sermon on the Mount. He sees the Sermon on the Mount as the guiding force within Christianity, and so did Gandhi. So if I might briefly, Gandhi's daily scriptural reading. They live in wisdom who see themselves in all and all in them, whose love for the Lord of love has consumed every selfish desire and sense craving tormenting the heart. Not agitated by grief, nor hankering after pleasure, they live free from lust and fear and anger, fettered no more by selfish attachments. They are not elated by good fortune, nor depressed by bad. Such are the seers. When you keep thinking about sense objects, attachment comes. Attachment breeds desire, the lust of possession, which, when thwarted, burns to anger. Anger clouds the judgment and robs you of the power to learn from your past mistakes. Lost is the discriminative faculty, and your life is a waste. But when you move amidst the world of sense, from both attachment and aversion free, there comes the peace in which all sorrows end, and you live in the wisdom of the self. The disunited mind is far from wise. How can it meditate? How be at peace? When you know no peace, how can you know joy? When you let your mind follow the siren calls of the senses, they carry away your better judgment as a cyclone drives a boat off the charted course to its doom. King, like Gandhi, saw his efforts at justice as experiments in love. Basic philosophy guiding King in his writings, Testament of Hope, agape, is a willingness to go to any length to restore community. From the beginning, a basic philosophy guided the movement that it would be nonviolent resistance, non-cooperation with evil, passive resistance, and Christian love. It was the Sermon on the Mount, rather than a doctrine of passive resistance, that initially inspired the people of Montgomery. It was Jesus of Nazareth that stirred the Negroes to protest with creative weapon of love. In other words, Christ furnished the spirit and motivation while Gandhi furnished the method. It goes on, and the times I've gone through civil disobedience, you go through a day or two of training, and then you go through the arrest, and then I found people start bringing out Martin Luther King, and you read it together. Everybody will read a paragraph. So the idea is if you're bold enough to take this step, keep reading, see what the next step is going to be. So in an early writing, and this is 1955, talks about, in this method, it must be emphasized that if one uses this method because he is afraid or merely because he lacks the instruments of violence, he is not truly nonviolent. That's why Gandhi often said that if cowardice is the only alternative to violence, it's better to fight. This is ultimately the way of the strong man, not a method of passivity. He goes on, his second basic fact that characterizes this is that it does not seek to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding. Reconciliation is more important than victory. Third characteristic is directed against the forces of evil rather than the persons who happen to be caught up in the evil. The tension in Montgomery is not white against black. The tension is at bottom justice against injustice, the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Fourth, it characterizes nonviolent resistance is a willingness to accept suffering without retaliation. to accept blows from the opponent without striking back. Rivers of blood may flow before we gain our freedom, but it must be our blood. The ancient doctrine of turning the other cheek. Unearned suffering is redemption. Fifth point concerns nonviolent resistance in that it avoids not only external violence, but internal violence of the spirit. At the center of nonviolence stands the principle of love. The nonviolent resistor would contend that in the struggle for human dignity, the oppressed people of the world must not succumb to the temptation of becoming bitter or indulging in a hate campaign. And here's where he talks about agape. He begins by loving others for their sakes in an entirety, a neighbor-regarding concern for all others, makes no distinctions between friends and enemies. It is directed toward both. With King's victory in Montgomery came a following, came money, came opportunity, so the rest of the country could see him. And it wasn't long before the rest of the world could see what he was saying. I submit that while we sometimes see him as a civil rights leader, he really was a global leader, and his call was to be the conscience of the country and the soul of the nation with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where they started training people in nonviolence so that more people could join in the struggle, the peaceful struggle for peace. If I might race forward, Gandhi, and King quotes this in The Social Organization of Nonviolence, claims that at first your opponent and the forces of power will ignore you. Then they'll mock you. Then they have to fight you. Then you win. The idea is it's a constant struggle. You never stop. Never. Because ultimately you'll figure out the words, the way to frame things, the way to inspire people, and ultimately you'll be able to get people to change their hearts and minds through love. That was where he was headed with it. Let me share to the National Press Club in 1961. Certainly we must continue to work through the courts and legislative challenges. But those who adhere to the method of nonviolent direct action recognize that legislation and court orders tend only to declare rights. They can never thoroughly deliver them. Only when the people themselves begin to act are rights on paper given lifeblood. It also makes possible for the individual to struggle to secure moral ends through moral means. The path is the pace, is the goal. I feel that this way of nonviolence is vital because it's the only way to reestablish the broken community. It's the method which seeks to implement the just law by appealing to the conscience of the great decent majority who through blindness, fear, pride, or irrationality have allowed their consciences to sleep. Now, some of King's most stirring and bracing criticism were toward the churches that he felt were too passive, both black and white. And he talks about any religion that contends that it will save the souls of man and doesn't confront the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that cripple them, is a dry as dust religion. So he is calling out the churches to do more. And he paid a price with that. While he was quite popular in 1963 with the I Have a Dream speech, when he comes out against the war in Vietnam in 1967, and he said, there is no great sadness without great love, and that for him silence was betrayal. At that point he loses about half of his following in the black and in the white community. And the churches leave him. It is one more cross to bear, as he had premature morality to see what was happening in the war in Vietnam. You know, I'd submit that with King, many people know the I Have a Dream speech, and they've heard it and they could memorize it. But I've noticed in my classes over the years that few students, younger or older, have read what King said after the I Have a Dream speech, in his writings, in his sermons, or in his speeches, where he starts to talk about the dream being a nightmare, and he starts to talk about the forces of oppression that have caused poverty, where people fall into despair and fall into riots, and that the riot is the language of the unheard, and that the bombs dropped in Vietnam are exploding in the inner city. And most don't know what King was doing in 1968 with a call for a Poor People's March on Washington, or that he was defending the sanitation workers in Memphis in stirring, crisp, prophetic language, saying that it is a crime in this wealthy nation for people to work for starvation wages. And the minimum wage today is lower now than it was back then, and it's still a crime, and somebody needs to be calling it a crime. It's trapping people in poverty. King's language starts to approach the language of Amos when he moves into this, and if I might check my notes to share a little bit more with you. We have made of this world a neighborhood, and yet we have not made it a brotherhood. We must learn to live together as brothers, or we will perish as fools. We are caught in an inescapable web of mutuality, a single garment of destiny. An injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. In his sermon, Love, Law, and Civil Disobedience, he saw the same longing for dignity that we see in oppressed people all over the world is seen in a new determination in the civil rights movement. Those in privileged positions seldom give it up voluntarily. And here he quotes Frederick Douglass. Those in power never give up without a fight, never have and never will. The question is how the struggle is to be engaged. King in 67 is damning poverty, which he's seeing in the inner cities. You may not have heard this line. The curse of poverty has no justification in our country. It is socially as cruel and blind as the practice of cannibalism. Now, that's a line that could be used in the mass media every year when we celebrate King's birthday. But we don't tend to hear much about the later king, who was a global citizen, calling out the powers that be. Let me move to those who would be arrested for civil disobedience, the pledge that you would take prior to it, and then I'll move to a speech in late 67, and then some closing remarks. Meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. Remember always that the nonviolent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. Walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. Pray daily to be used by God in order that all men might be free. Sacrifice personal wishes in order that all men might be free. Observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. Seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. Refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, or heart. Strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health, and follow the directions of the movement leaders and the captains. King in 1967. Tell me if this doesn't apply today. America is at a crossroads of history, and it's critically important for us as a nation and society to choose a new path and move upon it with resolution and courage. It's impossible to understate the crisis we face in America. The stability of civilization, the potential of free government, and the simple honor of men is at stake. Those who serve in the human rights movement, including our Southern Christian Leadership Conference, are keenly aware of the increasing bitterness, despair, and frustration that threatens the worst chaos, hatred, and violence our nation has encountered. In a sense, we're already at war with and among ourselves. Affluent Americans are locked in the suburbs of physical comfort and mental insecurity. Poor Americans are locked inside ghettos of material privation and spiritual debilitation. And all of us can now feel the presence of a kind of social insanity which could lead to national ruin. The true responsibility for the existence of these deplorable conditions lies ultimately with the larger society, with those in power, and with those in government. King calls for a revolution of values to accompany the freedom and scientific revolutions engulfing the earth. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, property rights and profits are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism can't be conquered. He goes on, let me paraphrase. This revolution of values must go beyond capitalism and communism. We must honestly admit that capitalism has left a gulf between superfluous wealth and abject poverty, has created conditions permitting undreamed luxuries and massive poverty with it. A true revolution of values will look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it'll look at millions of working people displaced from their jobs with reduced incomes as a result of automation, while the profits of employers remain intact, and say this is not just. It'll look across the oceans and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of these countries, and say this is not just. It'll look at our alliance with the landed gentry of Latin America and say this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting the poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of people normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. These are revolutionary times. All over the world, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression, and out of the wombs of a frail new world system of justice and equality are being born. A genuine revolution of values means, in the final analysis, our loyalties must become global rather than sectional. Every nation now must develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in our individual societies. And with climate change, one wonders how King would have added to all of that. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern beyond one's tribe, race, class, and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love for all men. This often misunderstood and misinterpreted concept has now become an absolute necessity for the survival of man. When I speak of love, I'm speaking of that force which all the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is the key that unlocks the door that leads to the ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about the ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first epistle of St. John. Let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. King lays it out, I think, in a form that we can borrow for today. We do not have released from the government the files on his assassination. They are still locked up. We built the monument to King before we released those files. I think it is most fitting for us to call for a day of prayer and fasting on behalf of the rights of children at the steps of our State House, April 2019, for the rights of kids in April at about the time King was assassinated, to make clear, as clear as we can make it, what King was fighting for in 1968, because I think that's the place that we need to pick things up and finish the civil rights movement.
Amen.
When I would play the movie Selma in class, I really wouldn't want to talk afterward, because you don't want to follow a prophet. And I can't say anything more than he said it. He said it all for me, some that I was able to remember with you. I've memorized after reading this year after year to students. And then finally waiting for someone to take a step, to have a day of prayer and fasting, so that we can raise these issues. Maybe we can be the spark to the state and to the country on things that we've been wanting for a long time. And I thought somebody with a southern accent, somebody from the ministry, somebody smarter than me, somebody tougher than me, and I got tired of waiting. And I guess at 67, late in my teaching career, I never thought the country would be at this point, and I think we can move forward, but all of us, I would submit, are going to have to pray more, reflect more, read more, talk lovingly with others who disagree with us more, and organize more. Get outside of our comfort zone more and do more. All change comes from the bottom up, not from the top down. When the people agree, the leaders all of the great movements in this country, we saw it with the civil rights movement in our time, the gay rights, environmental rights, all the way back to the abolitionist movement, the populist movement against the banks and the big railroads that strangled people's opportunities and left them in despair, the progressive movement, the women's movement, the labor movement, were all from the bottom up, not from the top down. I honestly believe that part of our history needs to be clarified more in the schools. People have to take it to heart. Our nation was formed, early patriots pledged their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor to form America. I think that's what it's going to take for us to reform America. And I think we have that fight in us. People are awakened in a different way, and I want to move that struggle along the best I can. I think the electoral arena is only part of it. Most of it goes on in the streets and in the hearts and minds of the public. I deeply believe with King, pluribus unum, out of many, we're one.
Amen.